Welcome to Awaken Soul, a gateway to profound near-death experiences and spiritual revelations. Here, we share true stories of those who have glimpsed the afterlife, encountered divine beings like Jesus, Mother Mary, and the Supreme Creator, and return transformed. Their journeys remind us that Earth is merely a training ground for the soul to grow in wisdom, compassion, and love. Beyond this 3D world lies our true home. Are you ready to awaken? And remember, subscribe now to watch authentic and deep videos every day and uncover the truth beyond this world.
The Revelation, a priest's near-death vision, and the divine truth behind the Hollywood fire. The stained glass windows of St. Jude's Catholic Church cast a kaleidoscope of colors across the worn wooden pews. Father Michael O'Connell, a man of 58 with kind eyes and a receding hairline that spoke of years spent wrestling with both earthly and divine matters, adjusted his vestments. The scent of incense, a familiar comfort, hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the exhaust fumes and the relentless hum of Los Angeles that pulsed just beyond the church doors. He glanced at the sparse congregation. Mrs. Rodriguez, her face etched with the worries of a single mother, sat in her usual spot, her rosary beads clicking softly. Young Tommy, fidgeting as always, was probably more interested in the pigeons outside than the sermon. And Mr. Henderson, the retired accountant, whose stoic expression never seemed to change, whether he was hearing about the miracle of the loaves and fishes or the latest stock market crash. Father Michael sighed inwardly. It wasn't that his parishioners were bad people. They were good, decent folks, struggling to make sense of a world that often felt senseless. But there was a growing disconnect, a quiet erosion of faith that he felt powerless to stop. The dazzling allure of Hollywood, the relentless pursuit of material wealth, the constant barrage of messages telling people they didn't need God. It all seemed to be winning. He'd been a priest for over 30 years, and he'd seen the shift. When he first started, the pews were fuller, the donations more generous, the sense of community stronger. Now, he often felt like he was preaching to the choir, or worse, to an empty hall. He'd tried everything, modernizing the music, hosting community events, even starting a Twitter account which mostly gathered dust. Nothing seemed to make a difference. His own faith, once unshakable, had developed hairline cracks. He still believed, of course. He had to believe. But the doubts whispered in the quiet hours of the night. Was he truly making a difference? Was God even listening? Was any of this real? Or was it just a comforting story he told himself and others to ward off the existential dread? He pushed the doubts aside. He had a sermon to deliver. Today's reading was from the Gospel of Matthew, about the importance of storing up treasures in heaven rather than on earth. He knew it was a message that would likely fall on deaf ears, especially in the city of dreams and illusions. My brothers and sisters, he began, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. We live in a world obsessed with material possessions. We are constantly bombarded with messages telling us that we need more, that we need to be richer, more famous, more beautiful. But what does it all mean in the grand scheme of things? He looked out at the faces before him, searching for a flicker of understanding, a spark of connection. He saw polite attention, but not much else. He continued, drawing on the familiar words of the scripture, trying to infuse them with passion, with conviction. After the service, he stood at the church doors, shaking hands and offering words of comfort and encouragement. Mrs. Rodriguez thanked him for the sermon, her eyes brimming with tears. Tommy ran past, chasing a pigeon. Mr. Henderson gave a curt nod and walked away. As Father Michael watched them go, he felt a familiar pang of loneliness. He was surrounded by people, yet he felt profoundly alone. He longed for a sign, a tangible proof that his work, his life, had meaning. He yearned for a connection to something greater than himself, something that would banish the creeping doubts and reignite the fire of his faith. That evening, he ate a simple dinner of soup and bread in the rectory, the silence broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He turned on the television, flipping through the channels until he landed on a news report about the upcoming Golden Star Awards, Hollywood's biggest night. He watched the endless parade of celebrities on the red carpet, their faces gleaming with artificial smiles, their bodies adorned with expensive jewelry and designer clothes. He saw the fawning reporters, the screaming fans, the sheer spectacle of it all. A wave of weariness washed over him. It wasn't envy he felt, but a profound sense of sadness. This was the world his parishioners were immersed in, the world that was shaping their values and beliefs. How could he possibly compete with this? How could he convince them that true happiness wasn't found in fame and fortune, but in something far more profound, something that couldn't be bought or sold? He turned off the television, the images of glittering excess still swirling in his mind. He went to bed early, but sleep wouldn't come. He tossed and turned, his mind racing, his heart heavy with a premonition he couldn't quite name. Something was coming. He felt it in his bones. Something big, something terrible. He just didn't know what it was. The week leading up to the Golden Star Awards was a frenzy of activity, a carefully orchestrated performance of glamour and extravagance that captivated the city, and indeed much of the nation. Father Michael observed it all with a growing sense of unease, a feeling that the spiritual chasm between his world and the world of Hollywood was widening into an unbridgeable gulf. Newspapers and magazines were filled with breathless coverage of the nominees, the designers, the parties. Every detail, from the cut of a dress to the choice of a caterer, was dissected and analyzed with an intensity usually reserved for matters of state. Social media was a firestorm of speculation, predictions, and hashtags. Father Michael couldn't escape it. Even his own parishioners, normally reserved and respectful, were caught up in the excitement. During coffee hour after Sunday Mass, the conversation revolved not around the scripture readings, but around who was expected to win Best Actress and which designer would create the most talked-about gown. He tried to steer the conversation back to matters of faith, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with a teaspoon. He felt increasingly like an outsider in his own community, a relic from a bygone era. One afternoon, he found himself driving past a billboard advertising the Golden Star Awards. The image was a close-up of a famous actress, her eyes sparkling with manufactured emotion, her lips painted a perfect shade of crimson. The tagline read, "Where dreams come true." Father Michael scoffed inwardly. Dreams come true? What about the dreams of the homeless man he'd seen sleeping on a park bench that morning? What about the dreams of the families struggling to make ends meet in his own parish? What about the dreams of a world where compassion and kindness mattered more than wealth and fame? He realized that the problem wasn't just Hollywood itself, but the values it represented, the values that were increasingly permeating society as a whole. The relentless pursuit of self-gratification, the elevation of celebrity above all else, the belief that happiness could be found in external things. These were the idols of the modern age, and they were far more powerful than any golden statue. He visited Mrs. Rodriguez, the single mother from his congregation. Her small apartment was a stark contrast to the opulent mansions he'd seen on television. She was struggling to pay her rent, worried about her son's future, and exhausted from working 2 jobs. "Father," she said, her voice weary, "I try to be a good person. I pray every day, but sometimes I just don't understand why things are so hard. I see all these rich people on TV, living these perfect lives, and I wonder, where is God in all of this?" Father Michael didn't have an easy answer. He couldn't tell her that God favored the wealthy and famous. He couldn't tell her that suffering was a virtue. He could only offer her words of comfort, a reminder that she was not alone, and a prayer that her burdens would be eased. But as he left her apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was fighting a losing battle. The glittering allure of Hollywood, the seductive power of materialism, was a force far stronger than anything he could offer. He spent the next few days in a state of quiet despair. He went through the motions of his priestly duties, but his heart wasn't in it. He felt like a shepherd whose flock was being led astray by wolves in sheep's clothing, and he was powerless to stop them. The night before the awards show, he found himself staring at the crucifix above his bed. The figure of Christ, hanging in agony, seemed to mirror his own sense of helplessness. He knelt and prayed, not for a miracle, not for a sign, but simply for the strength to carry on, to continue his work, even in the face of overwhelming indifference. He knew that the next day would be a celebration of everything he stood against. He knew that the world would be watching, mesmerized by the spectacle, oblivious to the spiritual void at its core. And he knew, with a growing sense of dread, that something was about to break. The tension, the dissonance, the growing chasm between faith and the world. It was all reaching a breaking point. He just didn't know what form that break would take. The Golden Star Awards ceremony was, as expected, a lavish affair. Father Michael watched it on a small, old television in his rectory, a sense of morbid curiosity drawing him in despite his better judgment. He wasn't interested in the awards themselves, but in the atmosphere, the underlying message that the event conveyed. The red carpet pre-show was a parade of extravagance. Celebrities, adorned in jewels that could probably feed a small village, answered inane questions from gushing reporters. The air was thick with self-congratulation, a celebration of an industry that seemed increasingly detached from the realities of everyday life. Father Michael felt a growing sense of disgust. He saw through the carefully constructed facades, the practiced smiles, the hollow pronouncements of gratitude. He saw the emptiness behind the glitter, the spiritual bankruptcy that lay beneath the surface. The ceremony itself was a carefully choreographed spectacle of song, dance, and self-importance. Awards were handed out, speeches were made, and tears were shed, both real and manufactured. Father Michael watched it all with a detached cynicism, his heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. Then came the moment that would change everything. The award for Best Director was being presented. The nominees were announced, the tension built, and the envelope was opened. The winner was a renowned filmmaker named Alexander Thorne, known for his provocative and often controversial works. Thorne, a tall, imposing figure with a silver beard and piercing blue eyes, strode to the stage with an air of self-assured arrogance. He accepted the award with a smirk, thanking his cast and crew, his producers, and his agent. Then, he paused. The music faded. The audience held its breath. "I want to say something a little different tonight," Thorne began, his voice amplified throughout the auditorium and broadcast to millions around the world. "I've been thinking a lot lately about the nature of reality, about the meaning of life, about the source of our creativity." He paused again, letting his words hang in the air. "And I've come to the conclusion that there is no God. There is no supreme being, no higher power, no divine plan. We are alone in this universe, responsible for our own destinies. We are the creators, the artists, the storytellers. We are the ones who give meaning to a meaningless world." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the audience. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others looked intrigued. Thorne continued, his voice rising in intensity. "We don't need fairy tales and ancient myths to guide us. We don't need to cower before some imaginary deity. We are the masters of our own fate. We are the gods of our own creation." He raised the Golden Star Award above his head. "This," he declared, "is our salvation. This is our truth. This is our power." The audience erupted in applause. Not everyone, but a significant majority. The cheers and whistles echoed through the auditorium, a resounding rejection of the very concept of a higher power. Father Michael watched in stunned silence. He felt a cold dread creep into his heart. It wasn't just Thorne's words, but the reaction of the audience, the collective embrace of a worldview that denied the existence of God. It was a slap in the face, a deliberate act of defiance. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest. He gasped for breath, clutching at his shirt. The room began to spin. He slumped back in his chair, his vision blurring. He heard the applause on the television, the triumphant music, the celebratory cries. It all seemed distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. He closed his eyes, his last thought a prayer, not for himself, but for the souls of those who had so blindly rejected the truth. Then, darkness. The news broke early the next morning. Massive fire engulfs Zenith Studios. Father Michael, still in his darkened rectory, oblivious to the world, remained in his unconscious state. He wouldn't learn of the fire until much later. The initial reports were sketchy, filled with more questions than answers. A fire had broken out at Zenith Studios, one of the largest and most iconic movie studios in Hollywood. The cause was unknown, but the flames were spreading rapidly, fueled by strong winds and years of accumulated flammable materials, film stock, sets, costumes, props. Within hours, the fire had grown into an inferno. A massive plume of black smoke billowed into the sky, visible for miles. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning plastic and chemicals. Fire engines from all over Los Angeles County raced to the scene, but they were fighting a losing battle. The images on television were apocalyptic. Walls of fire consumed entire sound stages. Explosions rocked the ground as gas lines and propane tanks ignited. The iconic Zenith Studios sign, a landmark that had stood for decades, was engulfed in flames, its letters twisting and melting in the intense heat. The fire spread beyond the studio lot, threatening nearby businesses and residential areas. Evacuations were ordered, and a state of emergency was declared. The National Guard was called in to assist with the firefighting efforts. The news anchors struggled to maintain their composure as they reported on the unfolding disaster. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented. Zenith Studios, a symbol of Hollywood's glamour and power, was being reduced to ashes before their eyes. Speculation about the cause of the fire ran rampant. Some suggested faulty wiring, others arson. Still others pointed to the unusually dry and windy conditions. But no one had a definitive answer. The human cost was still unknown. While most of the studio employees had been evacuated, there were reports of missing firefighters and security personnel. The search and rescue efforts were hampered by the intense heat and the unstable structures. The economic impact was staggering. Zenith Studios was home to numerous ongoing film and television productions. Millions of dollars worth of equipment, sets, and footage were destroyed. The fire would have a ripple effect throughout the entertainment industry, disrupting schedules, delaying releases, and costing countless jobs. But beyond the economic and logistical consequences, there was a deeper sense of unease, a feeling that this fire was more than just an accident. It was a symbol, a sign, a portent of something larger and more ominous. The news coverage shifted from the immediate details of the fire to interviews with stunned celebrities, studio executives, and local residents. Many were in shock, unable to comprehend the scale of the destruction. "It's like a scene from a movie," one actress said, her voice trembling. "But it's real. It's really happening." A studio executive, his face covered in soot, spoke of the loss of irreplaceable historical artifacts, of decades of Hollywood history gone up in smoke. A nearby resident, her eyes red from crying, described the fear and panic as she fled her home with her children, not knowing if they would have a house to return to. The fire burned for days. Firefighters worked around the clock, battling exhaustion and the relentless heat. The smoke plume darkened the sky, casting a pall over the city. The smell of burning permeated everything. As the days passed, the initial shock gave way to a growing sense of grief and bewilderment. Why had this happened? What did it mean? Was it just a random act of nature? Or was there something more to it? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, adding to the sense of unease and foreboding that had settled over Los Angeles. The city that had always prided itself on its ability to create illusions, to make dreams come true, was now facing a harsh and undeniable reality. The fire had stripped away the veneer of glamour and revealed a deeper vulnerability, a sense of fragility that no one could ignore. And in a small, quiet rectory, miles away from the raging inferno, a priest lay unconscious, his body fighting for survival, his soul on a journey that would reveal the truth behind the flames. He was unaware of the chaos unfolding in the outside world, unaware of the questions being asked, unaware that he held the answer. His journey was just beginning. The pain was the first sensation, a crushing weight on his chest, as if an elephant were standing on him. Father Michael gasped for air, but his lungs felt like they were filled with concrete. Each breath was a struggle, a desperate fight for survival. He tried to move, but his limbs were heavy and unresponsive. He was trapped, pinned down by an invisible force. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, his heart hammering in his chest like a trapped bird. He was vaguely aware of the television, still droning on in the background. He could hear snippets of words, fire, Hollywood, disaster, but they didn't register. His entire world had shrunk to the agonizing pain in his chest and the desperate struggle to breathe. His vision began to blur. The edges of the room dissolved into a swirling gray mist. He felt a strange detachment from his body, as if he were floating above himself. Watching the scene unfold from a distance, he saw his own body, slumped in the armchair, his face pale and contorted in pain. He saw the flickering images on the television screen, the scenes of destruction and chaos. He saw the crucifix on the wall, the symbol of his faith, now seeming distant and irrelevant. He felt a sense of panic rising within him, a primal fear of the unknown. He was dying. He knew it with a certainty that transcended logic. He wasn't ready. He had so much left to do, so many questions unanswered. He tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was a blank, his thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. He could only cling to the fading remnants of his faith, a desperate hope that there was something beyond this pain, this darkness. Then, the pain began to recede. The crushing weight on his chest lifted, the gray mist cleared, and he found himself standing in a place that was both familiar and utterly alien. He was in a tunnel, a long, dark passageway that stretched out before him, seemingly without end. The walls were smooth and cool to the touch, and a faint, ethereal light emanated from somewhere ahead. He felt a sense of peace wash over him, a profound calm that he hadn't experienced in years. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of curiosity and wonder. He knew, instinctively, that he was no longer in his physical body, that he had crossed over into some other realm of existence. He began to walk, drawn forward by an irresistible force. The tunnel curved gently, and the light grew brighter with each step. He felt a sense of weightlessness, as if he were floating on air. He heard sounds, whispers of voices, faint melodies that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He felt a presence, a sense of being surrounded by unseen beings, their energy benevolent and welcoming. He knew that he was on a journey to the other side. He didn't know what awaited him, but he was no longer afraid. He was ready to face whatever lay ahead, to embrace the mystery, to surrender to the unknown. The tunnel continued to unfold before him, the light growing ever brighter, the sense of peace deepening with each step. He was leaving behind the world of pain and suffering, the world of doubt and uncertainty. He was entering a realm of pure light, pure love, pure consciousness. He was going home. The tunnel seemed to stretch on infinitely, yet Father Michael felt no sense of time passing. He was enveloped in a profound stillness, a silence that was both comforting and awe-inspiring. The only sound was the gentle whisper of his own breath, a subtle reminder of the life he had left behind. As he moved further into the tunnel, the light at the end grew increasingly intense. It wasn't the harsh, glaring light of the sun, but a soft, radiant glow that seemed to emanate from within, illuminating everything without casting shadows. It was a light that felt alive, intelligent, and infinitely loving. He began to see figures moving within the light, shadowy forms that gradually became more distinct. He recognized them, not with his eyes, but with his heart. They were people he had known and loved, people who had passed away long ago. He saw his parents, their faces younger and more vibrant than he remembered them. They smiled at him, their eyes filled with a love that transcended words. He felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of joy and sorrow, as he reached out to them, his hands passing through their ethereal forms. He saw Father John, his mentor from the seminary, the man who had guided him on his spiritual path. Father John nodded in approval, his expression conveying a sense of pride and understanding. He saw other familiar faces, friends, relatives, parishioners who had passed on. They all greeted him with warmth and affection, welcoming him to this place of peace and tranquility. The sense of love that permeated the tunnel was overwhelming. It was a love that was unconditional, all-encompassing, and utterly transformative. It washed away all his doubts, all his fears, all his regrets. He felt completely accepted, completely forgiven, completely whole. He realized that this was what he had been searching for his entire life. This connection to something greater than himself, this sense of belonging, this unconditional love. He had glimpsed it at times in his earthly existence, in moments of prayer, in acts of kindness, in the beauty of nature. But here, it was pure and unadulterated, the very essence of existence. As he approached the end of the tunnel, the light became almost blinding. He felt himself being drawn into it, enveloped by its warmth and radiance. He surrendered to the experience, letting go of all earthly attachments, all earthly concerns. He felt a sense of merging, of becoming one with the light, with the love, with the infinite source of all creation. He was no longer a separate individual, but a part of something vast and incomprehensible. He experienced a profound sense of knowing, an understanding that transcended language and logic. He saw the interconnectedness of all things, the intricate tapestry of life, the divine plan that unfolded throughout eternity. He saw his own life, not as a linear sequence of events, but as a single, unified whole. He saw the joys and the sorrows, the triumphs and the failures, the moments of grace and the moments of darkness. He saw how everything was connected, how even the most difficult experiences had served a purpose, had led him to this moment of revelation. He felt a sense of gratitude, a profound appreciation for the gift of life, for the opportunity to learn and grow, to love and be loved. He understood that death was not an ending, but a transition, a return to the source from which he had come. He was ready to stay. He had no desire to return to the world of suffering and separation. He wanted to remain in this place of perfect peace, perfect love, perfect unity. But then, he heard a voice. The voice was not like any he had ever heard. It wasn't a sound that vibrated through the air, but a resonance that filled his entire being, a communication that bypassed the senses and went straight to the core of his soul. It was a voice of infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite love. He knew, instinctively, that he was in the presence of God. It wasn't a physical presence, not a being with a form or a shape. It was more like an all-encompassing energy, a consciousness that permeated everything, a source of all that is, was, and ever will be. He felt no fear, only awe and reverence. He was humbled by the immensity of the presence, yet he also felt a profound sense of belonging, a feeling that he was home, that he was connected to this divine source in a way he had never fully realized before. The presence communicated with him, not through words, but through understanding. It was as if his mind was open to a vast ocean of knowledge, and he could simply absorb the information he needed. He asked, in his thoughts, about the fire. Why? Why did it happen? The answer came immediately, a clear and unwavering understanding. It wasn't a punishment, not in the traditional sense. It was a consequence. It was a direct result of the collective rejection of spiritual truth, a manifestation of the power of belief, or rather, the lack of it. The presence showed him the awards ceremony, the moment when Alexander Thorne had denied the existence of God, the moment when the audience had applauded his words. It showed him the energy of that moment, the collective wave of disbelief that had rippled out into the world. It explained that humanity had been given free will, the ability to choose between faith and doubt, between love and fear, between connection and separation. The choices they made, individually and collectively, had consequences. They created their own reality. The fire was a reflection of that reality, a physical manifestation of the spiritual void that had been growing within society. It was a wake-up call, a warning, a demonstration of the power of the divine, even in its absence. It wasn't about retribution, but about responsibility. Humanity had created this situation, and humanity had the power to change it. Father Michael felt a profound sadness, a deep understanding of the suffering that had been caused, but he also felt a sense of hope. He saw that the fire, despite its destruction, had also created an opportunity, a chance for people to reevaluate their priorities, to reconnect with their spiritual roots, to choose a different path. He asked about his own life, about his doubts, about his feelings of inadequacy. The presence showed him that his doubts were not a sign of weakness, but a part of his journey. They were a catalyst for growth, a challenge to deepen his faith, to seek a more profound understanding of the divine. It showed him that his work as a priest, despite his feelings of loneliness and frustration, had touched countless lives. He had planted seeds of faith, offered comfort and guidance, and helped people find their way back to God. He understood that his purpose was not to be perfect, but to be faithful, to continue to serve, to continue to love, to continue to share the message of hope. Even in the face of adversity, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a clarity of vision that he had never experienced before. He was ready to return, to fulfill his mission, to share the truth he had been shown. The presence continued to communicate, revealing a vision of the future, a future that was both challenging and hopeful. It spoke of a great purification, a period of intense trials and tribulations that humanity would face in the coming years. It wasn't presented as a predetermined apocalypse, a fixed and unchangeable destiny. Rather, it was a potential outcome, a consequence of the choices that humanity would make. The great purification was not a punishment from God, but a natural consequence of the collective consciousness, a reflection of the state of the world. The vision was multifaceted, encompassing a range of challenges: environmental disasters, economic instability, social unrest, political upheaval, and spiritual crises. It showed him images of a world struggling to adapt to rapid change, a world grappling with the consequences of its past actions. It wasn't a picture of total destruction, but of a profound transformation. The old ways of being, the unsustainable systems, the materialistic values, all of these would be challenged, tested, and ultimately broken down. The presence emphasized that this was not a time for fear, but for courage and faith. It was a time for humanity to awaken, to remember its true nature, to reconnect with the divine source. It was a time for choosing love over fear, unity over division, compassion over greed. The great purification was described as a period of cleansing, a time of shedding old patterns and beliefs that no longer served humanity. It was a time of rebuilding, of creating a new world based on principles of sustainability, justice, and spiritual awareness. The presence showed Father Michael that he had a role to play in this process. He was to be a messenger, a witness, a guide. He was to share his experience, his vision, his understanding of the truth. He was to help people navigate the challenges ahead, to offer them hope and encouragement, to remind them of their inherent divinity. He was told that many would not believe him. They would dismiss his story as a hallucination, a fantasy, a delusion. They would cling to their old beliefs, their old ways of being, even as the world around them crumbled. But he was also told that some would listen, Some would be ready to hear the truth, ready to embrace the change, ready to co-create a new world. These were the ones he was to focus on, the ones he was to nurture and support. The vision was not a prophecy of doom, but a call to action. It was a reminder that the future was not fixed, that humanity had the power to shape its own destiny. The Great Purification was not an inevitable catastrophe, but a potential catalyst for transformation, an opportunity for humanity to evolve, to awaken, to create a world based on love, peace, and harmony. Father Michael felt a surge of determination, a renewed commitment to his faith, a profound sense of responsibility. He was ready to return, to face the challenges ahead, to share the message he had been given. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that he was not alone. He had the guidance of the presence, the support of his faith, and the love of the divine to sustain him. The transition back to his physical body was jarring. One moment, he was bathed in the radiant light, immersed in the infinite love of the presence, and the next, he was slammed back into the confines of his earthly form, the pain returning with a vengeance. He gasped for air, his lungs burning, his heart pounding erratically. He felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his chest, a reminder of the heart attack that had brought him to this point. He was disoriented, confused, struggling to make sense of his surroundings. He was lying on the floor of his rectory, the television still blaring in the background. He could hear the frantic voices of news reporters, the sounds of sirens and helicopters, the crackling of flames. He slowly sat up, his head swimming, his body aching. He looked around the room, his eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. He saw the crucifix on the wall, the familiar furniture, the stacks of books, all the mundane objects of his everyday life, now imbued with a new significance. He tried to stand, but his legs were weak and shaky. He stumbled, grabbing onto a chair for support. He felt a wave of nausea, and he closed his eyes, taking deep breaths to steady himself. He gradually began to recall the events of the past few hours, the awards ceremony, Alexander Thorne's speech, the sudden pain in his chest, the journey through the tunnel, the encounter with the presence, the vision of the Great Purification. It all seemed so surreal, so unbelievable. Was it real? Or was it just a hallucination, a product of his oxygen-deprived brain? He touched his chest, feeling the faint throbbing pain. He looked at his hands, seeing the wrinkles and age spots, the tangible evidence of his physical existence. He was alive. He had returned. But he was different. He had been changed by his experience, transformed by the knowledge he had gained. He could no longer go back to his old life, his old way of thinking. He had a mission now, a purpose, a responsibility to share the truth he had been shown. He knew that it wouldn't be easy. He knew that many would doubt him, ridicule him, even dismiss him as crazy. But he also knew that he had to try. He had to speak out, to warn people, to offer them hope, to guide them through the coming challenges. He stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, seeing a stranger staring back at him. His eyes were different, filled with a newfound intensity, a depth of understanding that hadn't been there before. He felt a surge of strength, a determination to overcome his physical weakness, to begin his work. He knew that time was of the essence. The Great Purification was not some distant event. It was already beginning. He went back to the living room and turned off the television. The images of the fire, the reports of destruction, were a constant reminder of the urgency of his message. He sat down at his desk, pulling out a pen and a piece of paper. He began to write, pouring out his experience, his vision, his understanding of the truth. He wrote about the tunnel, the light, the presence, the Great Purification. He wrote about the importance of faith, of love, of choosing a different path. He wrote for hours, the words flowing from him effortlessly, as if guided by a divine hand. He didn't stop to question, to doubt, to analyze. He simply wrote, letting the truth flow through him. As he wrote, he felt a growing sense of peace, a certainty that he was doing the right thing. He was fulfilling his purpose, his calling, his destiny. He knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous, filled with challenges and obstacles. But he was no longer afraid. He had seen the other side. He had experienced the infinite love of God, and he knew that he was not alone. He was ready to face whatever came, to be a voice of hope in a world of darkness, to be a beacon of light in a time of great change. He was a priest, a messenger, a witness to the truth, and his work was just beginning. The insistent beeping of a heart monitor dragged Father Michael back to consciousness. He blinked, his eyes struggling to adjust to the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room. He was lying in a bed, surrounded by machines, tubes, and wires. A nurse was hovering over him, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. "Father O'Connell, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice gentle. He nodded weakly, his throat dry and scratchy. "Water," he croaked. The nurse quickly poured him a glass of water and helped him to sit up. He sipped the water slowly, feeling the coolness soothe his parched throat. "You gave us quite a scare, Father," the nurse said. "You had a massive heart attack. You were clinically dead for several minutes." The words echoed in his mind. Clinically dead. He had been to the other side. He had seen the light. He had spoken with God. He looked around the room, taking in the sterile environment, the beeping machines, the concerned faces of the medical staff. It all seemed so distant, so unreal, compared to the vividness of his near-death experience. How long?" he asked, his voice still weak. "You've been out for almost 3 days, the nurse replied. "We were very worried about you." 3 days. He had missed the immediate aftermath of the fire. He had missed the initial reactions, the questions, the speculation. A doctor entered the room, a tall, serious-looking man with graying temples. He introduced himself as Dr. Ramirez and began to examine Father Michael, checking his vital signs, listening to his heart and lungs. "You're a very lucky man, Father," Dr. Ramirez said. "Most people don't survive a heart attack like that. You're strong." Father Michael smiled faintly. He knew that his survival wasn't just luck. It was a divine intervention. He had been sent back for a reason. As he recovered, he began to share his experience, cautiously at first. He started with the nurse, telling her about the tunnel, the light, the feeling of peace. He didn't mention God or the great purification, fearing she would dismiss him as delusional. The nurse listened patiently, her expression unreadable. She didn't dismiss his story outright, but she didn't seem entirely convinced either. She attributed it to the effects of oxygen deprivation, a common explanation for near-death experiences. He then told Dr. Ramirez, framing it as a vivid dream, a hallucination. The doctor, a man of science, was skeptical. He offered a medical explanation, citing neurological activity, endorphin release, and the body's natural defense mechanisms. But Father Michael knew the truth. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real. He spent the next few days in the hospital, undergoing tests and receiving treatment. He used the time to reflect on his experience, to process the information he had been given, to prepare for the task ahead. He realized that he couldn't simply blurt out his story to the world. He had to be strategic, to choose his words carefully, to present his message in a way that would be credible, that would resonate with people, that would inspire them to listen. He decided to start with his congregation. He would deliver a sermon, a powerful and moving account of his near-death experience, subtly weaving in the message of the great purification, the importance of faith, the need for change. He knew that it would be a risk. He could lose his credibility, his position, even his parish, but he was willing to take that risk. He had a responsibility to share the truth, to warn people, to offer them hope. As he prepared his sermon, he felt a sense of excitement, a sense of purpose, a sense of divine guidance. He was no longer the same man who had collapsed in his rectory a few days earlier. He had been transformed by his experience, empowered by the knowledge he had gained. He was ready to speak. He was ready to share his revelation. He was ready to be a voice for God in a world that desperately needed to hear his message. The following Sunday, St. Jude's was packed. News of Father Michael's heart attack and miraculous recovery had spread throughout the community, drawing in not only his regular parishioners, but also curious onlookers and even a few reporters. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, a mixture of concern, curiosity, and a hint of skepticism. Father Michael, still pale but noticeably stronger, stood at the pulpit, his eyes scanning the faces before him. He saw familiar faces: Mrs. Rodriguez, her rosary beads clutched tightly in her hand; Tommy, surprisingly still and attentive; Mr. Henderson, his expression as stoic as ever. He also saw new faces, people drawn by the rumors of a miracle, a near-death experience, a message from beyond. He began his sermon, not with the usual scripture reading, but with a personal account. He spoke of the fire at Zenith Studios, the sense of dread he had felt, the sudden pain in his chest, the collapse. He described the feeling of leaving his body, the journey through the tunnel, the overwhelming light, the sense of peace and love. He didn't mention God directly, not yet. He wanted to ease them into the truth, to build a connection, to establish credibility, Before revealing the more controversial aspects of his experience, he spoke of encountering deceased loved ones, of feeling a sense of belonging, of understanding the interconnectedness of all things. He described the beauty and the harmony of the other side, the absence of pain and suffering, the overwhelming sense of love. The congregation listened intently, captivated by his words. Some were moved to tears, others were visibly skeptical, but all were engaged. He had their attention. He then began to shift the focus, subtly introducing the concept of the Great Purification. He spoke of a time of challenges, a time of trials, a time of great change. He spoke of the need for humanity to awaken, to reconnect with its spiritual roots, to choose a different path. My friends, he said, his voice gaining strength, I believe that we are at a crossroads. We have been given a warning, a wake-up call. The fire, the destruction, the chaos, these are not random events. They are signs, symbols, reminders of the fragility of our world, of the consequences of our choices. He paused, letting his words sink in. He saw a mixture of reactions, confusion, fear, disbelief, but also a glimmer of understanding, a spark of hope. He then took the plunge. He spoke of the presence, of the divine being he had encountered, of the message he had been given. He spoke of God, not as a distant, judgmental figure, but as a loving, compassionate force, a source of all creation. He spoke of the Great Purification, not as an apocalypse, but as an opportunity for transformation, a chance for humanity to evolve, to create a better world. He spoke of the importance of faith, of love, of forgiveness, of choosing a path of peace and harmony. The reactions were immediate and varied. Some were deeply moved, tears streaming down their faces. Others were skeptical, whispering amongst themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some were angry, accusing him of spreading fear and superstition. Mr. Henderson stood up abruptly and walked out, his face a mask of disapproval. A few others followed him, but the majority remained, listening intently, their hearts and minds open to the possibility that what Father Michael was saying was true. He concluded his sermon with a call to action. He urged his parishioners to examine their lives, to reevaluate their priorities, to choose a path of faith and love. He reminded them that they were not alone, that God was with them, guiding them, supporting them. The future is not predetermined, he said. It is in our hands. We have the power to choose, to change, to create a better world. Let us embrace this opportunity. Let us walk together on the path of light. Let us build a future filled with hope, peace, and love. The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the church. It started with a few hesitant claps, then grew in intensity, becoming a thunderous ovation. Not everyone was applauding. Some remained silent, their faces etched with doubt and disapproval. But the majority were with him, their hearts touched, their minds awakened. Father Michael felt a surge of gratitude, a sense of accomplishment, a renewed sense of purpose. He had delivered his message. He had planted the seeds of faith. He had done what he was called to do. The aftermath of the sermon was a whirlwind of activity. He was inundated with questions, requests for interviews, offers of support. The local media picked up the story, and soon, Father Michael's near-death experience and his message of the Great Purification were being discussed throughout the city and even beyond. He faced criticism, ridicule, and even threats. Some accused him of being a charlatan, a fraud, a religious fanatic. Others dismissed his story as a hallucination, a product of his oxygen-deprived brain. But he also received an outpouring of support. People from all walks of life, from all faiths and backgrounds, reached out to him, sharing their own stories, expressing their gratitude, seeking his guidance. He realized that he had struck a chord, that he had tapped into a deep yearning for spiritual truth, a hunger for meaning and purpose in a world that often felt chaotic and meaningless. He knew that his journey was far from over. He had many challenges ahead, many obstacles to overcome, but he was no longer afraid. He had the truth on his side, and he was determined to share it with the world, no matter the cost. The months following Father Michael's sermon were a period of intense activity and profound change, both for him personally and for the world around him. His message of the Great Purification, initially met with skepticism and ridicule, began to gain traction as events unfolded that seemed to confirm his vision. Environmental disasters became more frequent and more severe. Unprecedented heat waves, droughts, floods, and wildfires ravaged various parts of the country, displacing communities and causing widespread devastation. Economic instability increased, with rising inflation, job losses, and growing inequality. The gap between the rich and the poor widened, fueling social unrest and political polarization. The world seemed to be teetering on the brink of chaos, and Father Michael's words, once dismissed as the ravings of a delusional priest, began to resonate with a growing number of people. He continued his ministry at St. Jude's, but his reach extended far beyond the walls of his church. He became a sought-after speaker, traveling across the country, sharing his story and his message with audiences of all sizes and backgrounds. He wrote a book detailing his near-death experience and his understanding of the Great Purification. It became a bestseller, translated into multiple languages, and sparking a global conversation about faith, spirituality, and the future of humanity. He faced constant opposition. The media, initially fascinated by his story, turned increasingly hostile, portraying him as a doomsday prophet, a fearmonger, a religious extremist. Powerful figures in the entertainment industry, stung by his criticism of their values, launched a campaign to discredit him. But he also found allies, unexpected sources of support. Scientists, academics, and even some prominent business leaders, recognizing the validity of his warnings, began to speak out, advocating for change, promoting sustainable practices, and calling for a more just and equitable society. A movement began to grow, a grassroots effort to address the challenges facing humanity, to build a better future. People from all walks of life, inspired by Father Michael's message, came together to create communities of resilience, to support one another, to work for positive change. The movement was not without its internal conflicts. There were disagreements about the best way forward, about the role of religion, about the nature of the Great Purification itself. Some interpreted it literally, as a divine punishment, while others saw it as a metaphor for the challenges facing humanity, a call to action, a chance for transformation. Father Michael, while remaining true to his core beliefs, tried to bridge the divides, to foster unity, to encourage dialogue and understanding. He emphasized that the Great Purification was not about judgment, but about choice. It was about humanity taking responsibility for its actions, about choosing a path of love, compassion, and sustainability. He continued to preach at St. Jude's, his sermons now attracting a diverse crowd, a mix of longtime parishioners, curious newcomers, and even some of his former critics. He spoke of the ongoing challenges, the need for perseverance, the importance of maintaining hope in the face of adversity. He saw signs of change, both large and small. People were becoming more aware of the environmental crisis, more conscious of their consumption habits, more engaged in their communities. There was a growing sense of interconnectedness, a recognition that we are all in this together. The ending had hope. The future remained uncertain. The challenges remained daunting. But there was a growing sense of hope, a belief that humanity could rise to the occasion, that a better world was possible.